Hello and welcome. My name is Naima Ramos-Chapman, and I'm the Associate Editor at Campus Progress and Pushback.org. And we're here with Aisha Moodie-Mills, the Advisor for LGBT Policy and Racial Justice here at the Center for American Progress. Today we're going to talk about challenges facing the LGBT community and her work with the FIRE Initiative, which explores the intersections between race, sexual orientation, economics, and public policy. So first to start, I just wanted to ask, is there a specific win, like one win, that the LGBT community and organizers have fought over the last several years that, is just stands out the most to you?
One win. Well, there's been so many. So surely the most publicized one was the dismantling of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. But to me, that's significant. But what's really significant are all the what I'll call micro wins that we've had. This administration has advanced LGBT rights in a way that no other administration has. And so what has been really powerful, I think, is that for the first time, the administration is looking at gay and transgender Americans, first and foremost, as Americans, and recognizing that we deserve the same opportunities and rights and responsibilities and to have the same obligations as everybody else. And so what I've seen is less of what I like to call expansion of rights and so much the equalizing of rights. So everything from the federal government is no longer allowing discrimination against gay and transgender employees in the workplace. They've extended benefits to the partners, same-sex partners. The Department of Health and Human Services is collecting data on sexual orientation. We've got bullying initiatives, which are thinking about LGBT youth, and I could go on and on and on. So much has actually been happening that for the first time, I'd say, what's really huge is that gay and transgender Americans are being treated, at least within the purview of the federal government, as actual Americans in an equal way. And so that's been really, really exciting for us.
As a millennial, I've interviewed conservatives, moderates, progressives on how they feel about social values, and we just seem more accepting. So I'm wondering, have public attitudes changed over the year that you've noticed, and how do young people compare to older generations?
I am thrilled that the millennials will be running the world sooner, hopefully, rather than later, because yes, we're seeing the big public opinion shift. And just to clarify, though, the general public has been relatively supportive, I'd say majority supportive, for years now on general civil rights for gay and transgender Americans. So, for example, the vast majority of Americans would say that they don't believe that gay people should be discriminated against in work. Now, granted, Congress has yet to do anything about that. I mean, the Congress is a lagging indicator as to what Americans feel and believe. So, in 29 states, you can still be fired from your job simply because you're gay, and in 34 because you're transgender. So we are seeing a huge shift, though, on marriage equality. I mean, that's kind of the big conversation that's really dominating the public discourse, is about attitudes on marriage. I'm hopeful and excited that the younger generations who think that these issues are non-issues, that this is just civil rights, everybody should be treated the same, are going to be in decision-making positions soon enough, so that we'll start to see more of the policy pieces come together in the future, because the balance of power is changing in terms of attitudes.
So you mentioned before same-sex marriage as being kind of like a pinnacle point in pushing the civil rights movement forward, but I read your report, Jumping Beyond the Broom, and I just loved that you talked about other issues, LGBT inclusive data, and looking at other segments of the LGBT community that are often ignored in some ways, like young people of color. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about your work with the FIRE Initiative and why looking at the entire community as a whole is so important for policy, and also which issues, aside from same-sex marriage, young people especially should care about.
We tend to want to make policy as if communities are monolithic, but we know that they're not. And so when you are let's talk about Black LGBT people specifically, because that's about the report that I wrote, when you are a person living at the intersections of race and sexual orientation, you're facing dual discrimination, systemic discrimination, because of your race and your sexual orientation. And so even if there are civil rights laws on the books that protect you because you're Black, that doesn't mean that your life is going to be peachy keen because you're gay and you're still vulnerable. And the consequence of that is real. So when we look at the data, we see that Black, gay, and transgender couples who are raising children, for example, are most likely to live in poverty with their children, be raising their children in poverty, than like any other population. We see that there are some really significant health disparities among the Black lesbian community that go beyond just what we see in, say, among Black women. There are high rates of domestic violence that aren't being addressed. We know that our youth are particularly vulnerable. LGBT youth homelessness is a very big issue that CAP has been working on. The numbers in New York City particularly really are striking, because out of all the homeless youth, like 44% of them are perceived to be queer, so they're LGBTQ, and then the vast majority of those kids are Black. So you've got all these Black queer kids who are homeless and living on the streets, and then there are the complications that come with that. So, survival trades wind them up connected to the juvenile justice system in some way. There are vulnerabilities to health disparities, to HIV/AIDS, and to just violence that they face, that are issues that we don't necessarily talk about, that we should, because these are populations that are vulnerable. And so that's the work that I do with the FIRE Initiative, is I have the conversations about the under-the-radar LGBT issues that matter to our day-to-day lives, that matter to our quality of lives, that we should be addressing. And not in a way, like I was saying earlier, that is about creating brand new laws, reinventing the wheel, having some special provisions, so much as making sure that the provisions that we currently have are inclusive.
Right.
So when we're talking
equalized.
Right. So when we're talking about the Violence Against Women Act, and we know that Black lesbians report, like 54% of them report having experienced some form of domestic violence, then we should be thinking about sexual orientation within the construct of creating that policy measure. When we talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, which is a very big conversation since the horrific data came out of the Department of Education this year, we should be thinking about not just race, because race is important. We know Black boys are caught up in the school-to-prison pipeline. But what we also know is that LGBT youth are disproportionately punished in their schools in a very harsh way, and the police are being called on them, and they're also caught up in that pipeline, which is why the juvenile justice system is overrepresented with LGBT youth. Right. Something like 17% of the system is LGBT youth, which is interesting because gay kids are like 4% of the population. So, and once they get into that system, there are a host of issues that deny them due process, dignity, respect. So when we're reforming the juvenile justice system, we've got to think about gender identity, sexual orientation, and race, and how all those play together in terms of the people who that system is touching. So that's what my work looks like. Are
there certain state valued initiatives? I know you were talking about certain discrimination laws and things in specific states and how they're kind of all different. So I was wondering if there are any initiatives that we should kind of keep our eyes out for that are coming in November that are really challenging the LGBT community.
Yep. So we've got 4. We're looking at ballot initiatives in Maine, in Maryland, in Minnesota, and in Washington State. Mm-hmm. And those are all going to be really interesting. 3 of them, with the exception of Minnesota, are affirmative, asking voters to come to the polls to affirm the ability to have, for same-sex couples to marry in those states. In Minnesota, they're fighting off a ballot measure that's a constitutional amendment that's trying to deny and strip rights away from the gay community. The one that I am particularly looking at personally that's going to be exciting to watch is Maryland, because Maryland has a very diverse population. And we have spent the better part of this year talking about this so-called fictitious Black versus gay divide. The National Organization of Marriage and the conservatives have tried to build this wedge between natural allies. And what we're seeing play out in Maryland is that the traditional civil rights community, Black clergy, and the LGBT community have band together to support same-sex marriage, and that is really powerful. And so I think that out of the narrative and the campaign, it'll be interesting to see, 1, how we fare, because we have such a diverse coalition there, and 2, how the messages that the Black clergy are pushing around the separation of church and state, around religious rights versus civil rights, which are RITES versus RIGHTS, how those ultimately play out in the electorate there. And I think that we'll learn a lot of lessons about our coalition building, about reaching communities of color around LGBT issues through what happens in Maryland.
Thank you so much, Aisha. So that's all the time we have for today. But if you like what you heard, please check us out at campusprogress.org and pushback.org. And don't forget to check out Aisha's report, Jumping Beyond the Broom, in the text below. Thanks.